Welcome to Bob's shop. Come on in. Well, here we are at the where we've been filming a lot of these videos. I think today we'll walk around the shop and I'll show you kind of what we got going on here in the shop. You know, we got a lot of projects going on. Well, this is kind of a long-term project here. This is a 41 Buick. We started out just building the frame for it. It kind of expanded from there. Now we're putting the motor and transmission in it, and rear end, suspension, brakes, gauges, steering. Well, you guys that build cars know how that goes, you know. Hey, as long as it's there, can we do this? Yeah, we're doing it. This car originally had a 320 straight 8 with dual carbs and a 3-speed manual. We're putting an 87 Buick Grand National turbo motor in it with a T5, and you can kind of see what we've done to the frame. We've grafted just a nice front with coilover shocks, you know, independent rack and pinion steering, disc brakes. Did kind of a nice job hooking her up, and then the rear end's been the same thing. You know, this car originally would have had a torque tube rear end in it, so we eliminated all that. Putting a knucklehead motor in my chopper. There you go, that's my knucklehead motor. It's going in place of this 100-inch RevTech motor. Nice running motor, but it's coming out. This one's going in. This is the main part of the shop where we do most of the work. This car, the first one we're coming up to here, that's a 56 Packard Executive. That's got, I think it's a 1-year only electric shift. There's no shift lever whatsoever. You push the button, and of course, most of you guys think, well, yeah, Dodge had that up through 64, 5, whatever. But that was actually a cable shift. This one's electronic. You push that button, there's actually a shift motor on the side of the transmission that shifts it, and that's the only way they shifted. And it's kind of an unusual one. We've converted that to a 4L60E, and I've adapted that electric shift to the 4L60E. So inside the car, sitting in the driver's compartment, you actually use the stock Packard electric shift buttons to activate the 4L60E. And of course, this is one of my own projects. We're putting a different motor in this crane. I don't know if you guys want to see that or not, but it's a conversion. We're doing it. So on this one, we took the Ultra Glide out, and you can see how well the 4L60E fits in there, even though it's an X-frame. I get a lot of questions on the phone about, well, I got an X-frame car, that won't fit. And it's like, who told you it won't fit? Well, my buddy told me, or I read it on the internet. Man, measure them up. Look how nice this thing fits in this X-frame. Tons of clearance, lots of room. No notching for this, nothing. The only thing we had to do is we had to beat the front of the firewall up by the back of the engine. Other than that, it's wide open down here. You could have a party with 40 linebackers. Well, this next car, it's a 54 Merc Convertible, power windows. It's got a 312 Y block in it from a later Thunderbird. So we're changing that one over, and we'll be talking about that in a second. Next one over is a 68 GTO, and we're doing quite a bit of work to that. We got the motor tranny out of it, redoing one of those internet brake systems that don't work. We're fixing that, remounted the body, all new body mounts. That'll be a nice car when it's done too. Well, this is a room where I pretty much keep my own projects. They're the ones that collect the most dust. You know, the average car guy never finishes his own car, right? Well, it takes me a long time to get something done. But anyway, here's a few of my projects. First one is this, it's a 1949 REO, and it started out with an absolutely perfect body to begin with. There was not any rust whatsoever. I mean, you take every body panel off it and examine the nuts, bolts, or the, between two, that's where you find it, is between where metal is bolted together or welded together. Nothing, absolutely no rust whatsoever anywhere on it. It was an old fire truck. You guys find fire trucks, they take good care of those things. They really start with a good body. I've had it remounted a couple of times. At first, I had the body on its complete REO frame, and after sitting for a while, I changed direction on it. I went and got a 2002 F450 all-wheel drive, and I had this extra 5.9 Cummins motor, and of course we adapted it to a 4L80E, and then I adapted the old Dodge transfer case onto the back of that, and I had the whole thing together with the steering, the brakes, everything was together. Then I took the body back off and had the body done, which is right here. The thing we did take out, and it was working, by the way, the windshield, the crank open windshield, I took that out because I just didn't want to take a chance on a leak, so we put the V-butt glass in it. Yeah, the whole front's been modified for the Cummins motor and the Hydro Boost brakes and a GM steering column. It's pretty much ready to go back on. We got the Dodge Cummins 5.9, nice running motor, completely ready to go. We got the exhaust on it, tranny's completely hooked up, transfer case, drive shafts, everything's ready to go on it. Upholstery's done. I don't know if you can see these welds with the light we've got, but those that's where the frames are joined. I've got the front half of the frame is the 49 REO, because the way the body mounted, the Ford has a really strange body mount on the front. So we went with the REO frame going to the front, which was absolutely perfect, and coincidentally was the same width and depth as the Ford frame back here. So we attached the frames together back here, so everything from here back is the Ford F450, and then the frame from here forward is the REO, with the exception of we put the Ford front drive axle on this thing. So all that's the steering, the suspension is still REO. We just moved it out. Here's some of the rest of the body. The hood on these REOs really make them stand out. And for those guys that don't know it, the band REO Speedwagon, well, they were going by and saw an old truck on the side of the road, I think, and just saw the name and thought it sounded cool, but that's what this is. If you look at the chrome script, it says REO Speedwagon. That's what it is, it's an REO Speedwagon. Yeah, of course, it's going to be two-tone. The fenders are black, inner louvers are black. Now we're going to go talk about and take a look at this car under the red cover. This is a 1954 Merc convertible that we're doing a conversion on. And never mind about that for sale call. It's not for sale. We're supposed to be taking that off. But she's a beauty. Definitely worthwhile spending some money on it. And that's got a 312 motor out of a T-Bird. We're just changing it over from the the old Merc-O-Matic to a 700 R4 on this one. This car is one of those ones that's a real challenge. Now, we've done a video on this conversion before, not on a 54 Merc, but on a 53 Packard. It's a 6-volt positive ground system that we changed over to a dual voltage system, so you can have 6 and 12 volt negative ground on the same car. You need 12 volts to run our adapter starter. We're doing this conversion where we put an alternator. So we start with putting an alternator on it. Then we run 2 of these Optima batteries in series. Now we have 2 different power takeoffs on this. The way I have it wired, it's fairly simple. You know, when people are doing conversions like this, first thing they think of is, oh God, all the work about changing the motors and the the fan motor and the top motor and the window motors and the all the light bulbs and relays and dash gauges and all that stuff. I don't do any of that. We run the whole car off 6 volts. I'm going to show you right here that off of this setup right here, when the engine's running, it's charging these 2 batteries at 12 volt. But with the same ground, this is the ground going to the block right here. Okay, I go to this stud. There's our voltage. You can run the whole car off of that right there. But when you run the start, what do you got there? 12 volts. So you got a dual voltage car, and the only thing from now on is you can't let just anybody work on it. I mean, the guy's got to be halfway smart, because you can wreck stuff. I've even still got the same 6-volt start relay on this thing, activated by the 6-volt ignition switch, and it just shoots 12 volts down to the starter. That's basically all that's doing. And now we're going to put a little fuse block on this thing so you can do power taps off, or if you want to do power accessories like a nicer radio, or 12-volt power antenna. Or one of the things we got going on here is he said his choke doesn't work. Well, yeah, he's got 6 volts going to it, so we'll wire that to 12 volts and that'll work. So the thing works really nice. And until we build 6-volt starters, that's pretty much what we're doing for those. But I'll lift this thing up in the air and we can take a look underneath it, and I'll show you the 700 R4 that we just put in it. All right, well, here we are under the 54 Merc, and this is what it looks like with a 700 R4 in it. There's another X-frame that everybody tells me, oh, you got to put a C4 in them because they don't fit. But if you look right here, there's plenty of room for that 700 R4. These notches I've put in it were only necessary to get the transmission up easily. We had it up in there, but to make it go in and out easily, we notched it, because it's the one thing the 700 R4 does have. It's a large pan area. So that's quite a bit bigger than the original Merc-O-Matic, but that's all we needed to do, is just make these tiny notches in these big I-beams, and that's not a big problem. You can see here our adapter plate. It's only 1 inch thick, doesn't move it much. And I don't know if you can see up above the 700, but there's just tons of room up there. In a little bit here, I'll walk over and I'll show you the tranny that came out of this car, the Merc-O-Matic at 2-speed, and it's sitting right next to the 700 R4, and I'll tape measure the thing for you, and you can see for yourself what the size difference is. So, yeah, the mini high torque fits in there nicely. Plenty of room up above the top of the case. The whole thing is hooked up to the stock Merc shifter, the same shift indicator, everything. Well, let's walk over and take a look at the Merc-O-Matic that we took out of this car, and I'll show you the difference in This is the original transmission out of that car. Came car came from the factory with this transmission in it behind that behind a, I think it was a 239 Y block at the time. Yeah, they made them in a lot of sizes: 239, 252, 272, 292, and 312. This was originally behind a 239, and when people call me up and just say I want to put a C4 in there, I always ask them, why do you want to use an old C4? I mean, they're just a problematic transmission as far as I'm concerned. But they say, well, 700 won't fit. Okay, here you go. Merc-O-Matic, factory from the. We're looking at approximately 17 inches on the height of that bell housing. And that's not the only thing. We're not just looking at the height of the bell housing. We're looking at the height of the bell housing at a certain distance back from the back of the motor. So this bell housing, if we go back, we're going back to 7 inches here. You're still at almost 16 inches in height, clear back to here. So that means that any car that could have had this transmission in it will have clearance for this bell housing. That's a huge bell housing. It's gigantic. It's much bigger than the 700 R4. And now if you think about it, the 700 R4 bell housing is no different in size than the 204R bell housing, because when they were first made, they used the exact same torque converter, and that's clearance for the torque converter. So on the 700 R4 and the 400 and the 350 and the 204R, what do we got? 17 inches, exactly the same, or maybe even a little lower than the original Merc-O-Matic. All right, and then the big test comes where we measure back 7 inches. It's right about the end there on that. What we're looking at, we're down to almost 13 inches if you look on plane. So this is actually quite a bit smaller than the original Merc-O-Matic bell housing. The only place 700 R4s get big is along the pan. And the frame tends to come in close to the back of the pan on an X-frame car, but this fits in perfectly. Now let's go for total length. 700s, for the most part, are all the same length. The only one that's not the same length is out of a Corvette, and it's about an inch shorter, not longer. We got 31.5 right here, total length of this transmission. All right, if you want to add in the output shaft, that sticks out another ½ inch, but it's basically 31 inches long. Let's look at the Merc-O-Matic, and this came out of the X-frame factory. 35. Okay, so we've pretty much debunked the theory that 700s won't fit in length or in bell height. Now let's look at the distance around here. Everyone says, oh, they're really big right there. Okay, well, if we just look at it from circumference, kind of a area here, we're looking at 7 inches. 7 inches between here to here. Factory Merc-O-Matic, 7 inches. Exact same distance around here. So the only difference is these have small pans on them, these have big pans. Other than that, this is a smaller transmission than that. Fit in easily. You don't need to go to a C4 to fit into these cars. Matter of fact, I've put these in every car you can name, including as far as I'm concerned, the hardest car to put these into is a 63 Riviera. And that's actually different than the 64, 5, and 6 Rivieras, because the 63 still had a Dynaflow transmission in it. The 64 and up had the ST400 in it. So that frame is a little different on that 63 Riv. That was a tough one. But we still got a 700 into that X-frame. We just tip it up, extension housing first, and then lift the front up. And then this part was a little bit into the X. And of course, the 39 and 40 Fords, they got an X-frame, but they've got and by they I mean like Speedway Motors and some other people, they have a kit where you just, you can bolt the whole center cross member up and the radius rods bolt right to it. So there's a kit to get around those. Those are hard too. So there you go. 700 fits in a lot of things. Matter of fact, as long as we're on this subject, why don't we walk in the other room and measure a couple other transmissions, and we'll keep debunking this theory about how these trannies don't fit into cars. I just hear that so often. All right, well, we're in my area where I store a bunch of trannies we use for trial fitting, size, rebuilding. You know, they're all core, well, not all cores, some of them are good trannies. We were just talking about the measurements on the 700R4 versus the Merc-O-Matic. And now the other thing I hear from a lot of people on their calls is that, well, I'm going to put a 204R in there because it's smaller than the 700. And that, it's so slightly different that I don't know why you'd choose that one. But anyway, I'm going to show you a measurement here. Okay, overall length, and we measured up that 700 previously, which was 31. Okay, we got 29, 2 inches. The 700 fits in every X-frame car I know. This is only 2 inches difference. Now, the problem that 2 inches difference doesn't matter is because the tranny mount on the back of this transmission is at the very end of the tail shaft. It's as far back as you can go on it, which means now your cross member has to be at the extreme rear of the extension housing, which doesn't come off this, by the way. You can't move it. So what you end up with is you have to have the cross member. If you have an X-frame car, that makes this much more difficult to mount than a 700. The 700 tranny mount, you can see right here, it mounts up on the case. So you can have your cross member forward and still have the extension housing into the X. See the difference here? What is that? 8 inches. You can move it forward of this one 8 inches. All right, and then the distance around, there's only a 1/2 inch difference in the main body, and the bell housing is the exact same size, because when they first built these, they had the same torque converter. The only difference in the torque converter now is they added 3 more splines on the 700 converter. The 200 had a 27 spline converter, the 700 and the 4L60Es have a 30 spline converter. That's the only difference in the torque converters now. 350 turbos. Arch shafts are exact same length as the 204R. 350 turbo is the identical length as the 204R. But the rest of it, bell housing is the same as a 204R and a 700R4, 4L60E. The main body is the same size as the 700 or the 4L60E, because that's what the 4L60E and 700 is based on, is a 350, not like what some people say. They think that the 200 is the 204R is based on a 350. It's not. It just happens to be the same length. It's totally different inside. Some of the components in 700s fits 350s. All right, well, this is another 350. This is the one with the 9-inch tail shaft. Measure that up. It's identical length as a 700. With everything else being identical. The same size body, same size bell housing. The only thing I don't have here to show you is a C4. They're smaller around in the body by about 1 inch, and they're shorter, and they have a small pan area. They're not overdrive, and we don't recommend them for our kits, because the only C4s that fit our kits, because we design our kits for overdrive transmissions, the only ones that fit it are ones that came from the factory originally behind the V8s with a 164 tooth flex plate. And there's nothing on the outside of the transmission that says that you can use to identify whether or not it originally had a 164 tooth flex plate. You just have to, the whole bell housing, the starter is moved over. So it doesn't fit our kit unless it had that. If it came from a 157, it will not fit our kit. And then people say, well, I'll just change the bell housing because they had bolt-on bell housings. Well, then you get into other problems, because they had, I think there's either 3 or 4 different sets of input splines on a C4, and not all the torque converters fit. So you got to have one that has the right set of splines for the right torque converter that will fit our kit. It's just it gets to be a nightmare trying to. I've had numerous times where people returned the kit because they said, well, you said it would fit a C4 and won't fit my C4. And it's like, everybody I talk to I tell them right out. I said it has to be one that originally came behind a 164 tooth flex plate to fit our kit, period. So then the guy says, oh, okay, no problem, I'll find that. He buys one, hands it to a technician and says, here, put this on. And if it's not right, I just get all kinds of calls. I just hate C4s. There's other reasons I hate C4s. I don't know if you guys know this, but you know, all the Ford trannies that they called 2-speeds, not all of them, there was a 2-speed, but they were actually 3-speeds, most of them. If they were cast iron, they had 3 gears. They only started in second gear as a traction control. They continued that up into the C4s. They call it the green dot C4, and if you had a Mustang with the shifter and there's a little green dot on the shifter, that meant that transmission started in second gear unless you manually pulled it down into low. If you accidentally get that transmission, or you get a valve body out of that transmission, you're going to wonder what's wrong with your transmission because it won't shift 3 gears. It starts out in second gear. And I've had that. I owned a tranny shop for many years, and I always hated C4s, and that was one of the reasons why. You know, sometimes you didn't know what they came out of if you bought one. So I just totally ignore C4s. Forget them. Everything else fits. That's why I'm doing this. Everything else fits in the car. You don't need a C4.